This afternoon, we have the privilege and pleasure to host my friend and colleague, Dr. Martin Kramer, who will be addressing us this afternoon. Dr. Kramer, just to read his bio, I'm sure all of you have received it in the invite, but just to those of you who have not had the opportunity, Dr. Kramer is the founding and president of Shalem College. He is the Walter P. Stern Fellow at the Washington Institute. And this afternoon, he will be examining how the founders of ASMEA, Professor Bernard Lewis and Professor Fouad Ajami, related to the influential concept of the term that was coined by Professor Samuel Huntington, which both Lewis and Ajami demonstrated an initial ambivalence, but then later accepted Huntington's theory, and really will examine how these rationales speak to most of us in today's environment. So really, we are excited for this great, I'm sure, insightful conversation. We will do our best after Dr. Kramer is done to get to the questions. Please type them in the chat. Questions we don't get to today, and we apologize in advance given the time constraints. You could always follow up and send us an email at our info@ASMEA Scholars email inbox, and we will do our best to also follow up there. So without further ado, Martin, the virtual floor is yours, and thank you again for taking the time to join us.
Well, thanks very much, Asaf. I'm delighted to open this new ASMEA webinar series, and I'm delighted to do so with a presentation focused on ASMEA's two founders, Bernard Lewis and Fouad Ajami. One of my motives in doing so is personal, one is institutional, and a third is intellectual. Let me share my screen, and then we'll proceed. Okay. Let me state the first motive first. I'm probably the only person who studied formally under both of them, and I stayed in friendship with them until they died. Ajami, in his early years in America, taught at Princeton, and I took his class as an undergraduate in 1973. Lewis came to Princeton a year or so later, and I began to study with him in 1976. Lewis's and Ajami's few years together in Princeton formed the basis of their enduring friendship, and I happen to be there in the background. So it's as a former student and friend to both that I see it as a personal duty to do what I can to keep the legacy of my departed teachers alive. This would be a more difficult task had other giants come along in their place, but there isn't anyone in the field of Middle Eastern studies who's risen to the fore in America to compete with either of them as public intellectuals. The second motive is institutional. Both men together founded ASMEA. At the time in 2007, they were at the height of their public visibility. Both had received the National Humanities Medal in the White House the previous year. And they decided to lend their prestige to ASMEA out of a shared conviction. Lewis summarized it himself at the time, and I quote him: "The study of the Middle East and of Africa has been politicized to a degree without precedent. There is an acute need for objective and accurate scholarship and debate, unhampered by entrenched interests and allegiances. ASMEA will provide this," end of quote. Now, Lewis had a lot more to say about objectivity. It's another topic. But just to be clear, he never thought perfect objectivity was achievable. He did believe that one had to strive for it as an ideal, and he charged ASMEA with doing just that. Now, the third motive is intellectual. Lewis and Ajami proposed answers to recurring questions. What explains conflict in the Middle East? How central is Islam to politics? Is democracy possible? The answers they proposed were powerful and controversial, so much so that some academics have tried to erase them from memory and from syllabi and bury their ideas. Now, one needn't subscribe to all those ideas to agree that in the great debates over the Middle East, Lewis and Ajami framed arguments that remain potent to this day, and they deserve to be heard and preserved. So much by way of my motives. I now come to the central theme of my talk. In 1993, Harvard professor Samuel Huntington published an article in Foreign Affairs under the title, "The Clash of Civilizations?" ? His core argument, and I'm going to quote him, was this: "It is my hypothesis that the fundamental source of conflict in this new world," talk about the post-Cold War, "will not be primarily ideological or primarily economic. The principal conflicts of global politics will occur between nations and groups of different civilizations. The clash of civilizations will dominate global politics. The fault lines between civilizations will be the battle lines of the future." Now, this article unleashed a firestorm of commentary and became perhaps the most seminal academic intervention in the debate over the nature of conflict in the post-Cold War era, and was especially reinforced after 9/11. Now it's important to remember that the clash of civilizations hypothesis never won official endorsement. To the contrary, as President George W. Bush said in an address to the nation in 2007, and I quote him, "This struggle has been called the clash of civilizations. In truth, it is a struggle for civilization." But many believe that the war on terror was a euphemism and that the United States was somehow bent on fulfilling Huntington's prophecy. But my purpose isn't to reassess Huntington's thesis. It's to focus on a quotation in his article. Now, in the article, Huntington wrote that, and I quote, "On both sides of the interaction between Islam and the West, on both sides, the interaction between Islam and the West is seen as a clash of civilizations." And he brought this quotation from Bernard Lewis. This is Lewis. "We are facing a mood and a movement far transcending the level of issues and policies and the governments that pursue them. This is no less than a clash of civilizations, the perhaps irrational, but surely historic reaction of an ancient rival against our Judeo-Christian heritage, our secular present, and the worldwide expansion of both." Now, in a footnote, Huntington located this quotation in Lewis's article, "The Roots of Muslim Rage," which appeared in the Atlantic Monthly in September of 1990. Now, this quoting of Lewis by Huntington led to the widespread conclusion that it was Lewis who came up with the clash of civilization, and he seeded Huntington with the idea. So when Lewis died in 2018, many obituaries gave him credit or blame for inspiring Huntington. As reported by the New York Times, Huntington borrowed the phrase for his article, crediting Mr. Lewis. The Washington Post obituary noted that Lewis had revived the phrase 2 years before it was popularized by Huntington. The Financial Times wrote that Lewis coined the phrase, which Huntington later popularized. The National Endowment for the Humanities proudly noted that Lewis's Atlantic article had originated in his 1990 Jefferson lecture in the humanities, and there he'd used clash of civilizations, a phrase, again, coined by Lewis and made famous by Huntington, and so on. Now, Huntington did credit Lewis. I myself recall a 2002 conference at Harvard attended by Huntington and Lewis, where Huntington tipped his hat to Lewis. Lewis in his memoirs wrote, and I quote, that Huntington graciously acknowledged that he had borrowed the phrase. But this turns out to be trickier than it seems. Now I'm going to cover 3 issues that complicate this very simple picture. First, it's quite possible, even likely, that Lewis himself borrowed Clash of Civilizations from someone else, in particular Arnold Toynbee. Now the evidence isn't unequivocal, but I think you'll find it intriguing. Second, Lewis wasn't altogether happy with the way Huntington recycled Clash of Civilizations, and he hesitated to endorse it. And this was due in part to the criticism of Huntington made by Fouad Ajami. And third, Lewis actually meant something different than Huntington. Lewis was making a specific observation about a rivalry between two sibling civilizations, a rivalry fueled by their resemblances. Huntington turned this into a general theory of conflict among all civilizations, a conflict fueled by their differences. So it wasn't just Ajami's objections that influenced Lewis, he had his own. So let's begin with the first. Huntington took the phrase from Lewis, but did Lewis invent it? Or did he encounter it elsewhere and recycle it himself? Both the phrase and the idea. To answer that question, you have to go back and ask when and where Lewis first used the clash of civilizations. Now, Lewis in his memoirs located it in a speech he gave in Washington in the summer of 1957. In an earlier article on Lewis, actually it was in the ASMEA journal, I located it in another speech he gave in Washington at the end of 1955, a couple of years earlier. But there's even an earlier instance. It appeared in print in January 1952 in the journal International Affairs, published by Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London. And the article was entitled Islamic Revival in Turkey. And it's a survey of the reemergence of Islam in that country, the most secular in the Islamic world. The article that was published in January of 1952 is signed October of 1951. And in the archives of Chatham House, it seems to be listed as a lecture delivered there on February the 2nd, 1951. Now, just who was this Bernard Lewis, who in early 1951 was lecturing on contemporary Turkey? At the time, he was almost entirely unknown. He was 34 years old, with a career so far devoted to classical Islamic history, was interrupted for 5 years by secret wartime service. He published 3 books, his PhD thesis, which was rushed to print in 1940, a very scant book on Turkey, also published in 1940, which he forever omitted from his publications list, and a short general book on the Arabs in history, published in 1950. So this was not the Bernard Lewis we came to know decades later. In early 1951, he was a promising young Don who had yet to make his mark. But Lewis was also just back from a fresh stint in Turkey, where he gained access to the Ottoman archives. And while there, he'd been captivated by Turkish politics, contemporary political scene, and the struggle for identity within Turkey. Would Turkey keep to the westernized, secularized path of Ataturk, or would a deep and suppressed Islamic identity reclaim Turkey? So in 1951, Lewis made his first claim to expertise of modern Turkey, which 10 years later would be cemented by publication of his classic book, The Emergence of Modern Turkey, 1960. So what did Lewis say in this 1951 lecture? Let me give you the quote and then put it in context. The quote, "In Turkey, as in other Muslim countries, there are those who talk hopefully of achieving a synthesis of the best elements of West and East. This is a vain hope. The clash of civilizations in history does not usually culminate in a marriage of selected best elements, rather in a promiscuous cohabitation of the good, bad, and indifferent alike." Now, today, we're perfectly content to talk about conflicts among states, nations, parties, interests, races, that is, elements we regard as fundamental building blocks of identity. But civilization, as one such building block, is very much out of fashion. Decades ago, Western civ disappeared from curricula, replaced by world history or global history. And it's difficult to find academics willing to generalize about civilizations, whether Western, Islamic, or other. Civilization itself is deemed to be a Western construct, best placed in scare quotes. But in 1951, the idea of a world composed of civilizations and history as a struggle of civilizations had enormous resonance. Its great apostle was the British historian Arnold Toynbee, and its Bible was his many-volumed study of history. For 30 years, Toynbee had been preaching the message that, and I quote him, "Conflicts between civilizations are terrible because civilizations are the most real and fundamental forms of human society." For Toynbee, the conventional history of nations and states was just so much ephemera. What really mattered were civilizations grinding against one another like these great tectonic plates. Now, in 1951, when Lewis gave his lecture, Toynbee was at the very height of his fame on both sides of the Atlantic. In 1947, he'd even been on the cover of Time magazine. So Lewis undoubtedly knew all about the theses of superstar Toynbee, but then so did millions of others. More importantly, though, Lewis at the time inhabited an institutional and an intellectual world dominated by Toynbee, the world of what I call civilizationalism. Now, let's begin with the obvious. I said that Lewis delivered that lecture at Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and it appeared in International Affairs, the Journal of Chatham House. Why there? Well, because in 1950, Chatham House had commissioned Lewis to do a study of modern Turkey and the West. Chatham House would fund his trips to Turkey, as many as necessary, recalled Lewis. So his 1951 lecture was a work in progress presentation for Chatham House. Now, by 1951, Toynbee had ruled the roost at Chatham House for almost 30 years. The larger project that incorporated Lewis's proposed book on Turkey was the brainchild of Toynbee. And to speak at Chatham House was to speak from Toynbee's pulpit, quite possibly with Toynbee in the audience. But it was more than that. Toynbee held himself to be an expert on modern Turkey. Though he'd been schooled in classical history, he'd gone out to Anatolia for 9 months in 1921 to cover the Greek-Turkish War, Turkey's War of Independence, for the Manchester Guardian. He'd also written 2 books about Turkey. The first, published in 1922, bore this title, "The Western Question in Greece and Turkey, a Study in the Contact of Civilizations." And there, Toynbee insisted that the conflict between Greeks and Turks wasn't national, but civilization. There's a statement there that may even be the antecedent of the clash of civilizations. It appears in a passage about the Balkan War of 1912. And I quote Toynbee, "The fundamental truth was that a number of Near Eastern Christians and Middle Eastern Muslims were bearing the brunt of one particular clash in a vast interaction between civilizations." A particular clash and a vast interaction between civilizations. So what appeared to be a local quarrel was an aspect of something much bigger, of 2 civilizations in conflict. Now, Lewis certainly would have known this book and also its sequel, Toynbee's 1927 book entitled Turkey. Interestingly, chapter 3 of that book and chapter 3 of Lewis's later Emergence of Modern Turkey have the same title, The Impact of the West. Now, on top of all this, Lewis's revered mentor and patron, Sir Hamilton Gibb, was a close collaborator of Toynbee and of Chatham House. As Lewis attests, Gibb was the most important of his teachers. In 1940, when the war broke out, Toynbee had mobilized Gibb for the Wartime Research Department of the Foreign Office under Toynbee's direction. And Gibb, in turn, had recruited Lewis. And the man who taught Lewis history proper, the Byzantinist, Norman Baines, was also a close friend of Toynbee. And Toynbee gave both Gibb and Baines the manuscripts of study of history for comment. And so it wouldn't be inaccurate to say that Lewis sat at the Chatham House table headed by Toynbee, although perhaps at the farther end. Not only did Lewis continue to deliver seminal lectures at Chatham House right through the 1950s, it was Chatham House which finally published his Emergence of Modern Turkey in 1960. Lewis then was a civilizationist, that is, someone who believes in civilizations as the definitive units of history, an idea that suffused the outlook of all his mentors were all partners of Toynbee. As Lewis wrote in his memoirs, and I quote him, "I am by vocation and profession a historian principally interested in the history of civilization." Lewis thought that Islam was more than a religion. It was a political, social, legal, intellectual, and artistic system, a civilization. As he put it in an interview, when I quote him, "Principally, I am interested in Islam as a civilization. What you define as different countries in different periods, I see as different aspects of the same thing." And when he went to pay his highest compliment to the Orientalist Gustav von Grunewald in an obituary, he called him, above all, a patriot of civilization, an epithet just as apt for Lewis himself. Now, of Toynbee himself, Lewis was critical. A few times he made reference to him. And while Lewis would become famous for his prescience, Toynbee was openly prophetic, and I think that put Lewis off. Of Toynbee's study of history, Lewis wrote, and I quote him, "To review it as history is as easy as to review the books of Daniel or Revelation, with which, despite the differences of scale and idiom, it essentially belongs." Toynbee's many generalizations about Turks and Arabs and Persians also seemed to Lewis those of a dilettante, as Toynbee had never learned the languages. And Toynbee's views on the Jews in Israel, Lewis would have found offensive. But he never said so, and his criticism of the study of history only appeared after Toynbee had retired from Chatham House. When Lewis had started out in current affairs, Chatham House had been the first rung on his ladder, and Lewis was always bound by a sense of gratitude for those who'd helped to launch him. Now we come to my second query. As I've shown, Lewis first used Clash of Civilization back in 1951, almost as an aside, perhaps even as a nod to Toynbee, were Toynbee in the audience. In 1955, 1957, and 1963, he used it in a very different context, before American audiences, not a British one. Now, in those years, he was a visiting professor, first at UCLA, then at Indiana University. His purpose was to arouse Americans to a realization that Arab sentiment wasn't just anti-British, but anti-Western, and that the United States would soon be its target. Now, we don't have time here to go through all the versions forensically. The 1955 version, you see it here, is the first articulated one, and it's historically, I'd say, shallow. Yes, there is, Lewis says, something deeper and vaster than a quarrel between state and state, even between nation and nation. It's not about specific grievances, Lewis says, and he writes, "What we are seeing in our time is no less than a clash between civilizations. More specifically, a revolt of the world of Islam against the shattering impact of Western civilization since the 18th century." The 1957 version goes back much further in history. There, Lewis calls the Clash of Civilization part of the Great Debate, described by the historian Edward Gibbon, between Islam and Christendom. Quote, and here I quote Lewis, "Since the Arab Muslim conquerors first swept westward into Christian Syria, North Africa, and Spain, it continued with the Christian counteroffensive of the Crusades and its failure, and the thrust of the Turks into Europe and their hard-fought retreat and withdrawal." End of quote. The reference to Gibbon here, I think, is especially significant. Lewis had a reverence for Gibbon's detached approach to Islam. Now, these two instances appeared as articles in hard-to-find books. The phrase became more widely known, and I underlined it myself as an 18-year-old student in his book, The Middle East and the West, which originated as a lecture series in Indiana in the spring of 1963. Now, here Lewis writes that the present discontents of the Middle East are best viewed not as a conflict between states and nations, but as a clash between civilizations. Gibbon is retained, but the historical references to events like the Islamic conquest and the Crusades are trimmed back. We're just told that the clash has been, as Lewis puts it, going on in one form or another since the Middle Ages. Now, this version is important, not only because it was the most accessible, but because, as we'll see, Lewis will revise it in a telling way. So Clash of Civilizations didn't suddenly emerge in 1990. That's when it came to the attention of the wider public and of Samuel Huntington. But to the best of my knowledge, Until Lewis revived it in his Jefferson lecture, an Atlantic article in 1990, he had gone for over a quarter of a century without repeating it. Now, I can only speculate as to why. After 1967, the Arab-Israeli conflict loomed large. And if he'd persisted, this question would have been posed to him. Is the Arab-Israeli conflict an aspect of the clash of civilizations? Or was it a clash between states? Then in 1979, Egypt made peace with Israel out of state interest. Lewis himself predicted that as early as 1969. After visiting Egypt that year, he wrote, and I quote him, "Between Israel and Egypt as Egypt, there is really no fundamental problem at issue, and it should not be difficult to reach some sort of compromise." That's 1969, before the 73 war. In 1989, he published an article in the American Scholar where he declared that the Middle East had entered the era of the state. All over the Middle East, he wrote, not only in old nations like Iran and Egypt, but even in some of the newest and most artificial, the state is once again becoming the primary focus of political loyalty and identity. Their destiny is one of separate political statehood becoming nationhood, end of quote. Then these states could align with the United States, make peace with Israel, and more. So why revive the clash in May 1990 in his Jefferson lecture? It's an open question. But by the time he published it in September, Saddam Hussein had just invaded Kuwait, and Clash of Civilizations had landed on the desk in the Oval Office. And here you see that it was, in fact, presented to President George H.W. Bush in preparation for an Oval Office discussion on the mood in the Arab world a few weeks after the Iraqi invasion. Now, it also landed on Huntington's desk, and then through his later article on millions of desks. But here things take a turn. The most scathing criticism of Huntington's article was written by none other than Lewis's close friend and disciple, Fouad Ajami. It was published immediately in Foreign Affairs under the title The Summoning, and it's a full-throttled assault on Huntington's premise. Huntington is wrong, Ajami wrote. He has underestimated the tenacity of modernity and secularism in places that acquired these ways against great odds. And this, Huntington would have nations battle for civilizational ties and fidelities when they would rather scramble for their market shares. And worst of all, Huntington buys Saddam Hussein's interpretation of the Gulf War. It was, for Saddam and Huntington, a civilizational battle. And Ajami's final verdict, and I quote him again, "We have been delivered into a new world, to be sure, but it is not a world where the writ of civilizations runs. Let us be clear, civilizations do not control states. States control civilizations." Now, Ajami would later retract this view and say that Huntington had gotten it right all along. As he put it, and I quote him, "Huntington's thesis about a civilizational clash seems more compelling to me than the critique I provided at the time." But he wrote that only in 2008. 15 years later, in 1993, when Ajami took his tongs to Huntington, he'd grown very close to Lewis. And it's impossible that his criticism of Huntington hadn't affected Lewis. The striking evidence you'll find the following year, 1994, when Lewis revised his 1964 book, The Middle East and the West. Now, as I've said, until the Atlantic article, and for 25 years, this had been the most accessible version of his Clash of Civilization formula. The 1994 revision of the book was retitled The Shaping of the Modern Middle East, and it had this sentence: "We shall be better able to understand the situation if we view the present discontents of the Middle East not as a conflict between states or nations, but as an encounter between civilizations." Encounter had replaced clash. Now, I spotted this almost immediately, and I asked him about it. Clash, he told me, in his words, was too harsh. After Huntington used Clash of Civilizations, Lewis never used it again. In his two post-9/11 bestsellers, What Went Wrong and The Crisis of Islam, it doesn't appear. The first edition of What Went Wrong had a subtitle that was very much in the In the Lewis tradition, Western impact and Middle Eastern response. This impact and response, a derivative of Toynbee's challenge and response, skirted the whole question of the unending clash, and Islam didn't figure here at all. In the paperback edition, the subtitle changed. It became The Clash Between Islam and Modernity in the Middle East. Now, obviously, this wasn't Lewis's first preference. The first preference was in the first edition. But I'm guessing that the publisher wanted to put clash and Islam on the cover to boost sales, and Lewis agreed. Even so, notice that the clash isn't between Islam and the West, between civilizations, but between Islam and modernity. It's a compromise formula that leaves Lewis's reservations about Huntington intact, although just barely. And now I come to my third and last question. What, beyond Ajami's view, was Lewis's reservation? What did he mean by too harsh? Huntington had gone further than Lewis, presenting the clash as a struggle among all the world's civilizations, fueled by cultural differences. Lewis had something else in mind. He held that Islam and Christendom, and later the West, were unique rivals, not because of their differences, but because they shared so much. The Greco-Roman legacy, Abrahamic monotheism, and the Mediterranean basin. Obviously, these sister civilizations, that was his phrase, they often clashed. But being so similar, they also borrowed and exchanged and translated. As he wrote in The Crisis of Islam, even in struggle and polemic, Christendom and Islam reveal their essential kinship and the common features that link them to each other and set them apart from the remoter civilizations of Asia. In 1996, when Huntington published a book-length version of his article, Lewis again kept his distance. He noted that, quote, there have been great struggles between Christendom and Islam in the past, and that, quote, there are still some on both sides who see world history in terms of a holy war between believers and unbelievers. That's how some see it. But for Lewis, this wasn't fate. A new era of peaceful coexistence is possible, he announced. So Lewis never denied coining the phrase clash of civilizations, but he meant it as a very partial description of the past rivalry of two sibling civilizations, and not a prediction of the future, certainly not for all conflict everywhere. In 2006, Lewis and Ajami received the National Humanities Medal in the Oval Office from President George W. Bush. Now, a simple explanation is that it was reward for their support for the Iraq War. And many critics of the Iraq War denounced the war as a practical extension of the clash of civilization thesis. In fact, Lewis and Ajami were being rewarded for arguing the opposite. As I've shown, Bush rejected the clash thesis in the apparent belief that nothing in Islamic civilization could block the march of democracy. They were like us. This was certainly the view of Ajami and of Lewis, that democracy's march was unstoppable. Now, Ajami's repudiation of Huntington had been explicit. Lewis's was implicit. His support for the democratizing mission was his own form of dissent from the clash thesis. How so? Lewis did believe in a perpetual clash between freedom and tyranny. The threat to freedom could emerge from any civilization, including, obviously, Europe's, as he himself, as a veteran of World War II, knew perfectly well. And democracy could take root in any civilization, despite its origins in Europe. Anyone, he asserted, I'm quoting him, anywhere in the world could develop democratic institutions of a kind, end of quote. Moreover, dictatorship was, as he put it, very alien to the foundations of Islamic civilization. And Iraq, he wrote in 2008, as it moved shakily to a kind of democracy, quote, proves what is often disputed, that the development of democratic institutions in a Muslim Arab country is possible, end of quote. Now we can debate that, but the simplistic narrative of Lewis begat Huntington, begat endless wars, is just wrong. And as far as Lewis and Ajami are concerned, at the crucial moments, the former, Lewis, distanced himself from Huntington's thesis, and the latter, Ajami, sharply criticized it. Lewis in his memoirs did say that Huntington had made, and I quote him, a real contribution to our better understanding of one of the great problems of our time. And perhaps he knew that Huntington's name would figure in every one of his own obituaries, and it would serve to offset the inevitable mention of Edward Said. And Ajami, as I've said, ended up saying that Huntington got it right. But this was all very late in the day. When it mattered, the clash thesis gave them down. When Lewis came to America as a visitor in the 1950s and 60s, speaking of the clash of civilizations, he was trying to get Americans to view the Islamic world like a European, as an ancient and intractable rival. After he settled in America, he ended up seeing Islamic lands like an American, as places ripe for reform and democracy. And the same for Ajami. He came to America in the beginning, urging it to see the Arabs as almost beyond redemption, and ended up arguing that they would accept the foreigner's gift of democracy. Neither scholar would have pursued on their own the totalizing hypothesis of the clash of civilizations. That's because both were men of multiple identities who transcended the two civilizations into which they were born and who widened and crossed the bridges between them. Thank you, and I'll end there.
Well, thank you for that, Martin, and for the phenomenal enlightening on this insightful lecture on a key issue that continues to obviously prevail. A lot of current day issues, and obviously, the fact that as you know better than anybody, the mention of Lewis and everything that is today, is obviously still relevant and needs to be unpacked and important. So there's a lot to discuss, and I thank you again for doing this for us. With that being said, I would like to open up the floor to questions. If you have questions, please start typing them in, and we'll be able to take your questions. And I think that maybe to start us off, I'll see Noam Stillman, who's the chair of our academic council. Do you want to ask our first question?
Actually, I want to make a comment that one of the things I think that was so insightful in this talk was that, on the one hand, and by the way, I think both Fouad Ajami and Bernard Lewis had a civilizational view all throughout, but on the other hand, they never were rigid with a frozen view, unchangeable view, and also that they had certain ideals which, from time to time, cast light on the way they wanted to express their visions. On the other hand, one can understand how Huntington took from Lewis that's the difference, I think, between a political scientist and I hope political scientists in the audience won't be offended, but how political scientists who tend to think in rather strict categories, whereas historians and students of civilization have a much more fluid view. But I would just point out that even Fouad Ajami in his early works, I mean, the Arab predicament deals in part with a Arab misunderstanding of what really is modern, and for him, modern civilization and Western civilization are more or less synonymous. I think you captured that very, very well, and that's really all. No question as such.
Oh, good. So Suzanne, I see we have questions starting to come in the chat. So why don't you start? We'll start taking those questions. Thank you for that, Mom.
Yes, we do. Okay, the first question I have here is from Professor Frank Salome. He writes, is the question one of clash or death of civilizations? A genealogical approach to history reveals civilizations going through birth, life, apex, decline, and death. So I guess my question is, are we talking about a clash between East and West, or simply a death, or one civilization, the West, and the vitality of another, Islam? Self-abnegation, if not hate, defines Christendom today, whereas self-love and confidence defines Islam.
Thank you, Frank. Good to hear that you're in on this call. It's a little more complicated than that when it comes to Lewis. Lewis was a historian. You could say he's a historian, especially in his work on the Ottoman Empire, of decline. He was a true adherent of the decline thesis when it came to Ottoman history. And his book, What Went Wrong, is really a forensic dissection of the reasons for decline. But it came from a specific personal context. Lewis was born in 1916. At the time of his birth, the British Empire was still at its height. By the time he left Britain for the US in the mid-1970s, the empire had dissolved. And it was the British who were preoccupied with finding the reasons for their decline. Some of them were fascinated by analogies to the Roman Empire. This has a long history among British historians. Lewis was different in that he focused on the Ottoman Empire. But I think that one finds in his laser-like focus on Ottoman decline a bit of a projection of an experience he himself lived through. Remember, he saw the 30s and the doubt that swept through the intellectual classes in Britain about empire. The Second World War, which left Britain impoverished, and the austerity that followed. The Suez Crisis, decolonization, previously the departure from India. So Bernard Lewis lived through not the decline of the West. The United States inherited, as it were, the mantle of Western civilization. But he lived through the decline of an empire which had lasted some 400 years. And that, I think, is something that should always be remembered when we focus on Lewis's interest in Ottoman and decline, and in the crisis, what he called the crisis of Islam more generally. Lewis was dealing with two civilizations which are still very much on the map. We're not talking about Assyrians here, or ancient Egyptians. It was Toynbee who, of course, was much more preoccupied with the rise and as he saw it, the inevitable decline of civilizations. This was not a theme that preoccupied Lewis. And I don't think it's a theme that very much preoccupied Huntington either. It was much more, I think, prevalent in the first half of the 20th century because of the two world wars. The feeling that Western civilization might be bent on suicide. The Cold War, to some extent, also perpetuated that. It's hard, short of nuclear catastrophe today, to imagine the death of a civilization, especially one as large as Islamic civilization. Perhaps there's a future Toynbee who will look back both at our civilization and Islamic civilization and draw up the record of their decline. Yes.
Okay, so we also have a question here from Joseph Steeb. He says, thank you for a fascinating talk. Given that there was a certain incommensurability in values and political systems between the West and Islam within this civilizationist outlook, how exactly, in Ajami and Lewis's perspective, was the U.S. invasion of Iraq supposed to turn the Middle East toward democracy?
That's a very good question. Lewis and Ajami both believed that there was a popular groundswell that would come forward in support of democracy once the dictator was removed. The problem was that the dictator, not just Saddam Hussein, but Arab dictators elsewhere, had been the most successful modernizers of the Middle East. So the first area of modernization had been military in the 19th century. And in the 20th century, it had been the modernization of the intelligence state. And this intelligence state had created means of repression and fine-tuned them to such a degree that there was no way, no one envisioned then the Arab Spring, no way that these mechanisms could be removed from within. But that the moment one removed them from without, the fact of dictatorship had inured these people, Iraqis first and foremost, from returning to dictatorship. Something else would emerge. Lewis was always very careful to say that democracy wasn't a toolkit, wasn't an assembly kit. You could just put it together from the pieces. It would be a long and protracted process. But he believed and said, and so did Ajami, that once the dictator was removed, the people themselves would create some form of representative government. Now, it happened. It was messy. The cost was very high. But as Lewis himself said later, he still saw signs of hope in the fact that today Iraq has political parties, it has elections, it has taken a step. More interesting, actually, is an article Lewis wrote towards the very end of his life in Foreign Affairs. He came probably the closest to predicting the Arab Spring of anyone. Now, at the time, people looked at it and said it's the wishful thinking of an overly optimistic professor who's bet very heavily on the Iraq War. But in fact, the whole discipline of Middle Eastern studies missed the Arab Spring. Lewis actually had one article in where he says explicitly that the existing totalitarian regimes no longer have enough control and command over the people's allegiances to continue. So I think the Arab Spring, and Fouad Ajami also said, he believed quite firmly that the removal of Saddam Hussein was the principal driving force in the Arab Spring, that breaking one Arab dictatorship was what helped to break down the wall of fear that prevented other Arab peoples from asserting their human and political rights. Now, all that is debatable, but that you ask how they saw it, that's how they saw it.
Okay, so they're coming in fast and furious. Okay, so we have another question here from Cole Bunzel. What accounts for Ajami's very late support for the clash thesis? If the clash of civilizations was incompatible with Ajami's support for the Iraq War, how does he end up supporting both?
I'm a bit perplexed by his 2008 article in the New York Times, I think in the review section, in which he backtracked. He said, I made a mistake. Huntington was right. If you read the article, you'll see that he adduces a number of things that Huntington claimed, that Ajami contradicted in the original exchange between them. For example, Turkey. Huntington said Turkey would be gravitating back towards Islam. In 1993, Ajami said there was no way that would happen. That looked very different in 2008. I think that to some extent, Ajami was himself very harsh in that, and he wanted to, in a way, smooth the edges of his very harsh criticism that he made earlier. So I don't know that he entirely endorsed the Huntingtonian view. And to be quite frank, I mean, Ajami was a man sometimes given to enthusiasms and rhetorical flights, which he himself, and I know this for a fact, later came to regret. So I think that he, and of course, 9/11 intervened between these two events, these two writings. But I do think that that overall, if one looks at the position of Ajami, he probably, on the spectrum, came down much closer on the side of democratizing than on the side of civilizational clash. And that remains so in his last books, too. I mean, The Foreigner's Gift is a good example of that, and also in his last collection of essays. So, as I say, occasionally you'll find what might best be described as some sort of deviation. I mentioned Lewis suddenly, after 25 years, talking about clash of civilizations, which he hadn't mentioned for 25 years, and then after that, not returning to it. And with Fouad Ajami, it's the same sort of thing. He was systematically anti-Huntingtonian. Then he had this sort of flash in which he said, I made a mistake. And then it seemed to me, he gravitated back in the other direction. Thanks, Cole.
Okay.
I'm doing this call.
Okay, our next question is from Professor Larry Simpson, the editor-in-chief of our journal. He says, can one understand Lewis's choice of the concept of a clash over modernity in the subtitle of the paperback edition of What Went Wrong as a kind of correction of what Huntington, by referring to Huntington's earlier seminal work, Political Order in Changing Societies, and implicitly arguing that Huntington had it right the first time?
I don't think so. Let me tell you why. You saw that I mentioned this article, Roots of Muslim Rage, which wound up on the desk in the Oval Office, and which was basically the text which provided Huntington with Clash of Civilizations. Lewis in his memoir said, I didn't particularly like the title of the article, but that's what editors do. They take your article with its subtle, nuanced title, and they jazz it up. And he said there, by the way, that actually in retrospect, I'm glad they did it, because it got the article much more attention. The place for nuance isn't in the title, the place for nuance is in the text. And given the fact that the first hardback edition published by Oxford University Press didn't mention clash or Islam in the subtitle, reflected, I think, Lewis's first preferences. But the paperback, which was already in the hands of a commercial press, there I think the editors said, look, it's not enough to say Western impact and Middle Eastern response. It's got to have clash and Islam in the subtitle. And you're identified with that because of Huntington. So Lewis probably thought, well, I'm not going to change the text of the book. I'm not going to in any way accommodate that. But certainly the title, which the book buyer sees opposite him in the store, on there I could be more flexible as long as I do it on my terms. And his terms were that it would not say, it would not explicitly say clash of civilizations or clash between Islam and the West, clash between Islam and modernity. And that's something very different. Modernity is not exclusively Western. Modernity is something that doesn't have civilizational depth. It doesn't go back to the Middle Ages. It's something of our time. So, so there I would be, of course, we're all speculating here. But, and I don't think that Lewis was immersed in the writings of Samuel Huntington. I don't think that he knew him personally all that well, like just passing acquaintance, and it wasn't his field. So I would be skeptical about whether that argument would hold.
Okay, we have a couple questions that are similar, but here's one from Jack McKay. He writes, how does the recent Abraham Accords change the narrative of conflict between Islam and the West?
well, the Abraham Accords are an interesting example of the role within Islamic civilization of minorities, which open portals to Western civilization. That's basically the story of the Gulf Arab states. If you look at, in Lewis's time, those portals were places like Alexandria, Beirut, Haifa, Izmir, Mediterranean port cities. And in these Mediterranean port cities, you had an amalgam of people. You had minorities, some of them Muslim, some of them local, some of them foreign. You had Muslim elites all interacting in order to open windows to the West. Nationalism destroyed them. Nationalism in Egypt, civil war in Lebanon, and nationalism in Turkey closed these portals. And they've opened up in our time along the Persian Gulf. The Persian Gulf today is what the Eastern Mediterranean was then, the place where interchange, commerce, ideas, foreigners, capital all flow freely. And in a way, Israel linking up to the Emirates is a case of creative minorities, one Jewish and one Arab Muslim, coming together to open this portal still wider. And by the way, it's important to remember those Arabs in those Gulf countries are minorities. In fact, so important was it to them to open these portals to the world that they allowed themselves to become minorities in their own countries, not citizen minorities. I mean, the others who are there are not citizens. They're in fact minorities, 12%, 15%, 20% of the population, depending on which Gulf country you're looking at. So the Abraham Accords, in a way, are a challenge to the civilizational thesis, because here you have very much a cross-civilizational cooperation in which Jews and Muslims cooperate in order to open still wider to the outside world.
Okay. This is a question from Stephen Baines. It's perhaps the concept of, in quotes, clash of civilizations resulted from a certain confusion between politics and culture? Question mark.
I'm not sure I understand what the question means. I'd only say, even going back to Toynbee, he thought that that civilizations were in fact political units in a sense. Yes, there were states, there were nations, but in the end, there was the to and fro of states and nations was fraught. And what was really important was civilizations. And civilizations, in a sense, leverage states to do their bidding, to extend their values, extend their religions, extend their ideas. So civilizations, in that view, were very political entities as well as cultural entities. It was Ajami arguing against that, who said that basically it was states that use civilizations, not civilizations that use states. But there was definitely something political in this, and it goes back to Toynbee himself. I mean, when he was talking about the Greco-Turkish conflict in 1921, he was a specific conflict on the ground between two different national groups professing two different religions. He saw this as the grinding together of these tectonic plates of two civilizations. The main criticism of this, by the way, came from Eli Kaduri in his Chatham House version. He said, Toynbee can't prove that this was in any way a civilizational conflict. This was the usual political conflict you have between two nations, two states, which you find in every place and clime. Toynbee vested civilizational conflict with political meaning. And to some extent, I mean, this is also what the classical position of Islam is, where there's no differentiation between Islam and politics. Lewis wrote on this quite extensively. It was something that was always hard to get Americans to understand. So just as Islam was inseparable from politics, so Islamic civilization was, in this view, inseparable from politics. So I don't think it's a confusion, or if it's a confusion, it actually is our confusion and perhaps not the confusion of members of or members or participants in other civilizations.
Great. Thank you for everything, Martin. I want to be cognizant of your time, and obviously, you've given us a lot of time today, and there's obviously a lot more to discuss. And I hope that we will continue the conversation. So I really want to take the opportunity to thank all the attendees for coming and joining us this afternoon. This is a sample of what I hope will be the beginning of further conversations and the kind of talent that we will be showcasing at our conference in November. Hopefully we can do it in person. But above all, I really want to thank Martin for taking the time to talk to us this afternoon. This is a critical issue, and obviously all of us who see ourselves as disciples of Ajami and Lewis, these are critical issues that continue to be relevant today, and even more so as time goes by, I think. And so there's a lot to discuss and a lot to continue. So so thank you again, and thank you everybody for joining us. And please be on the lookout for future events, which we will continue to promote, and we will talk again soon. So everybody have a good afternoon, a good evening in Israel, and everybody stay safe and healthy.